Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Atomy Brainwaves, our podcast on education for educators. Brainwaves is produced by our wonderful team here at Atomy. What is Atomy? It's an online teaching and learning platform for secondary education. We provide engaging, curriculum-specific video and text lessons for over 190 subjects, as well as matching quizzes and exam practice that can be used for both learning and formative assessment. We also provide powerful analytics that can help teachers diagnose how their students are progressing and zero in on who might need a little bit of extra help. Our goal is to help make life easier for our teachers, give them more time to work on the most important things, and ultimately help to generate better outcomes. If you want to find out more about Atomy, head over to our main site at getatomy.com and feel free to try it out for free. Today, I got to speak to David Didau, UK-based blogger, published author, an educational consultant. We discussed the advantage gap in the schooling system, how it can be addressed from both a school and individual teacher standpoint, and the roles that technology and cognitive psychology can play in the discourse around the issue. If you like the sound of that, feel free to subscribe to us at Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your podcast listening. And while you're at it, feel free to leave us a quick 5-star review. For now, take a listen and enjoy.
Are you going to teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Atomy Brainwaves. I'm your host Simon, and I'm joined today by our very special guest, David Didau.
Hello.
Author of the hugely popular UK blog The Learning Spy, published author, educational consultant and speaker, and former English teacher of 15 years. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. You're joining me from somewhere in the UK.
Yeah, just
think
outside
it's
Bristol.
Fair to say. Very nice. Surrounded by some... Our listeners won't be able to see this, but you're in a lovely library setting, surrounded by lovely books in the background. It looks like a very scholastic, academic...
Yes, it's my fortress of solitude.
Well, it's a good one. As fortresses of solitude go, it's I'm envious. So our central topic for today, for our discussion, is going to be this idea of closing the advantage gap, which is kind of a real something you know a great deal about, and we're hoping you'll be able to share plenty of expertise with us about. But before we get into that, whenever we have a guest on, we always like to ask them to just give us a quick run through of their journey in education, how you kind of started, how you got into the education world, and the various twists and turns along the way that led you to where you are now.
Okay. So I never had any ambition or desire to be a teacher. So it's one of those things that I fell into. And I'd like to say I took to it like a duck to water, but that would really be untrue. More like a fridge to water. My first few years teaching were, I think, god awful is probably the best way to describe that. And I think back to it, and it was in the 1990s, and it was a different world. My first year, my NQT year, which is what we have here in the UK for newly qualified teachers, they have a year where they're meant to be sort of monitored and mentored, and I didn't really get that. I think my first year teaching, I was pretty much left to my own devices. I was shown the stock cupboard and said, do what you want, and that's pretty much what I did. And I had no real idea what I was doing or why I was doing it, and made loads of terrible mistakes along the way. And I think one of my abiding memories was I had this one particular year 8 class. These are sort of 12, 13-year-olds, and in this, they weren't interested in anything that I had to tell them. And the deputy head of the school that I worked in was, saying in one morning briefing, he said, if anyone's having any trouble with students' behaviour, just give me a call, and I'll come and help you. And naively, I took him at his word, and he came into my lesson mid riot, and all the children sort of stopped strangling each other and sat down and sort of looked shamefaced, and he told them all off and gave them all a good telling off. And then he said to me after he'd done that, he said, "Come and see me at break because I think I know what the problem is." And then he left, and obviously then the riot started up immediately as soon as he'd gone.
Of course.
And then so I went to see him at break time. And he said, "I've worked out what you're doing wrong. You're not planning your lesson well enough." And which is a bit of a blow because I typically I'd be up till 11, 12 at night planning my lessons, trying to sort of frantically rack my brains for ideas about what would work and planning them to the minute and all the rest of it. And that to hear that I haven't planned it well enough was disappointing to say the least. And and I spoke to a few people and I thought about this for quite a while. And one of the things that really sort of dropped into place for me was that this guy, Mr. Noonan, the deputy head at this school, he hadn't planned his intervention at all. He just pitched into my classroom. He told the kids off, and they stopped what he was doing. And they stopped what he was doing not because he'd planned anything, but because they knew who he was, and they knew that they needed to behave for him because the consequences of misbehaving for him were far more severe. And they knew that I was a no mark, and there were no consequences at all for misbehaving for me, and so they did what they liked. And I stuck at it, and I'm amazed really in retrospect that I did. But I remember coming back after Christmas that same year, and the behaviour was just not as bad. And I remember taking one relatively pleasant chap to one side and saying, "Why? What's changed? Is it me or has something changed?" And he said something along the lines of, "Well, look, you've stayed, so you must not be that bad." And just durability, just sticking around, changes things. The following year, things were better, easier, and I stayed at that school for 5 years. And by the time I left, that I could pretty much, I could be that guy going in to people's classrooms, and silence would fall. And I would do no planning for that kind of thing. And the only difference was, my reputation, what they made of me and all that sort of thing. And so, over time, I started to, I suppose, get, a bit of a reputation as being quite good with the naughty children. And I found myself sort of cast in that sort of light. In one school that I worked at, I was one of a group of teachers who were asked to act as mentors for disaffected students, and one of the children I had in my disaffected mentee group was a young lad who what happened. What the school did is they gave him a red card, and if he felt really upset in his lessons, he could play his red card and send himself out of the lesson. And the instruction was that he would come to my classroom and he would just sit at the back of the classroom and try not to be irritating. This used to happen every now and again. He used to pop up. He'd come in midway through a lesson. He'd just sit at the back and get on with stuff. And he was never really much of a problem. And I remember one day he bowled in and he was in a fury, and he just sat at the back, sort of muttering, and he was followed up a few minutes later by his French teacher, who also was in a fury. She was really, really upset, and I can't remember now what he'd done, but he committed some sort of atrocity in the lesson, and she was really, really angry about it. She wanted me to do something, and I was saying, "Well, okay, look, I'll deal with this at the end of the lesson because I've got a class full of kids here. Can I talk to you both at the end?" And at the end of the lesson, before we went to see this French teacher, I said to this lad, we'll call him Ben. I said to Ben, "What did you do?" And he told me what his view, his take on what had happened. And I said to him, why did you do that? And he said, "Oh, well, it was my ASD, wasn't it? It was my ADHD, sir." And I said, "How come, Ben? How come you never have ADHD in my classroom?" And he said, "Well, you're all right, aren't you, sir?"
Okay.
And that was a real watershed moment for me. The fact that he was choosing where, just like my experience of being a young teacher and not really having any clue about what was doing. He was choosing where it was appropriate for him to do what he wanted and where it wasn't. and he'd obviously decided his French teacher wasn't someone he needed to moderate his behaviour for. He could act however he wanted, and we'd engineered a system at the school where I worked at the time where we accommodated that and we made that okay. And eventually, it was a year or so later. I can't remember all the details of it, but he went. I think he told the head to F off in the end, and that was one step too far, and he was excluded. And I don't think we did him any favours. I think in nothing that we'd done really in his time at the school had sort of prepared him for the idea that there might be consequences that you have to face eventually. And and I think that was a poor lesson. Anyway, so I don't know whether it just stopped me if this stuff is getting tedious.
No, it's very fascinating. It's sort of really fascinating insight into the kind of the psychology around classrooms, at least I guess within an older context. Although I would certainly say it's probably still something that's prevalent. So all feeding into the central idea as well of what we're coming to. But I guess kind of moving from, I suppose, that kind of teaching, all of those experiences within teaching, and then how did that to what more of sort of your current role is at the moment?
Okay.
I guess what would be the bridge? I suppose if you want to put it that way.
So I'm entirely really a product of social media. So in I think it was 2010, 2011, I went to a training course where the guy who was leading the training course said, "How many of you are on Twitter?" And like nobody put their hand up. And he said, "Well, you should." And being sort of keen and wanting to sort of do what I was told, I delved into it and I found it fascinating. I found a diversity of opinion that I had never ever experienced in my career. I found people who believed things and expressed opinions that I had just never come across before, and I found that quite sort of upsetting and shocking at times that people would say stuff and I'd think, "What? How can you believe that?" And then the more I listened to the debate, the more knowledgeable I became about the different positions people held. I started to recognise that some of the things that I'd taken for granted were, they weren't any more true than anything else. They were beliefs. They were ideological, and that was it's that really that set me off on a quest really to find out as much as I could. I started writing a blog. And initially, the idea behind that was to just to record my thoughts and ideas and stuff I tried out in the classroom. And very often in the past, I'd sort of do stuff in the classroom and then never remember what it was. And just life continues on. And so this became a sort of record of and reflection on what I was doing. And I found it was a great joy to me to find that there was an audience. There were people who were interested and who commented and were keen to hear more. And I'd never, I think, with a background, as a literature graduate and being an English teacher, you always sort of dream, don't you, of some sort of quasi literary career. And I'd found out years previously that I'm absolutely rotten at writing fiction. I'm just really dull at it. I bored myself, so I figured I'd bore everyone else too.
I'm sure it's not as bad as you think.
It was pretty bad.
You're underselling yourself.
No, it was pretty bad. And it was a joy to find that I could write non-fiction in a way that people found engaging, and I took that as an encouragement. Whether or not I should have done is another matter. And I was. Somebody got in touch to ask if I'd commission me basically to write a book and on English teaching, and it's very much a product of this time. I don't have any great, I don't set any great store by it now. But it was a great opportunity, and it was now I think sort of 8-9 years later, anyone who's teaching that wants to write a book, there's a sort of mechanism for doing that. But at the time, that felt really, really, like I hadn't dreamt that might be a possibility, and so that was the start. And so, I wrote that, and then I started writing another book, and people started getting in touch with me to say, was I, could I come and speak at events? Could I do training? And I'd say, no, I've got a job. And I negotiated with the school I was at if I could do a part-time role so that I could start to try and take some of the opportunities that were being offered, and I did that for a short while. And then I think what really happened is I moved. I got sort of, I got a bit overexcited. I was headhunted to work at a school in quite a sort of prestigious job that I really fancied doing, and I felt, and I was sort of seduced into it against my better nature. Really, it was living away, and I decided, I threw everything into it. I felt really, very much that I wanted to give it a go, and then the school that I'd been recruited into, they then also recruited a head teacher who hadn't been involved in anything, in getting me on board, and quite quickly it sort of turned out, it became clear that he didn't really want me there, and I spent the first 2 terms working there and just feeling really, really miserable and unhappy, and being asked to do things that I really didn't want to do, and I had a long sort of, I remember talking to my wife about it, saying, I'm really unhappy. I don't want to do this. It's making me miserable. And with her support, I decided I would risk becoming an independent rent-a-gob and see how it went. And fortunately, that was in 2012. And thankfully, it's I've managed to sort of cling on throughout that. Yeah. So the late, this, and I certainly don't want to play my tiny violin, but that it's been a blow to my the old career with lockdown taking. Because what I would normally be doing is visiting schools and speaking at events, and obviously none of that's happening. And and who knows what the future will bring. I've always said, that, and I don't mean this in a dismissive way or anything like that, but if the worst comes to the worst, if I can't do this anymore, then I can always go back to the classroom. And I think, that for a few years, I really didn't want to be in the classroom at all, and I was really glad not to be. It felt like, it felt like such a relief not to have the Sunday evening worries and the end of holiday anxiety about going back to school and all. And I think that over the past 2 or 3 years, a lot of the training that I've been doing with schools has been me suggesting, let me show you what I mean by teaching classes, by teaching kids in the way that I'm proposing and the things that I'm proposing, and finding out that, obviously it's highly artificial. It's not like being a real teacher, because there's me in a room of kids that don't know me with like 6 people watching and quite often being filmed. And but it's been really, really good to try and reclaim and generate again some of that sort of back and forth between young people. That's really, when people say to me, do you miss teaching? The honest answer is no, because I don't miss all of the administration and all of the marking books and parents' evenings and all of the stuff that isn't teaching. But if teaching was just teaching, it would be a wonderful job. But sadly, it isn't. So
all of the bureaucratic elements that come in tandem with it.
I think so, and the sense, the sense that I often get talking to teachers, that they often feel that they're asked to do things that they feel are pointless, and they can't see any purpose in. They don't think it's making their lives or the lives of their students any better, and so that's very dispiriting when you feel that you don't have that agency and that control. Remember, one of the first things I sort of identified when I was no longer in the classroom was just sort of recognizing I can have a coffee whenever I want. I can go and have a poo. No one's going to say anything. That felt really, important.
Getting that autonomy back. Yeah.
The amount of stress that comes from having no control over your day-to-day life isn't something that I identified or noticed until I no longer had it in my life.
Yeah.
So
it's a really powerful observation, I suppose, which I suppose is not the first way that people would often think about it. But hey, it's a really a brave choice, I have to say, and I'm quite fascinated by the role that social media plays in this transition for you, which you touched on, because it was really interesting hearing you talk about it, because oftentimes social media and Twitter and the discourse, it can be framed as such a toxic, negative element, and it can be, unfortunately, with regards to a lot of areas, it can lead to just really reductive sort of debate. But it's really interesting and kind of inspiring in a way to hear that your experience of it was so much more positive, and that it opened your mind rather than closed it, and kind of opened up all of these possibilities for you.
But Simon, this makes me sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but it wasn't like that then, or at least, my experience of it. That tribalism didn't seem to exist in the same way. And I remember, as that, I think, I had a sort of fairly sort of public volte-face with, some of the opinions that some of the things I thought were true, and people's response to that was largely positive, and people, and it's very, very reasonable that you get new information and you change your mind. Why wouldn't you do that? But there were definitely some people who felt a sense of betrayal with that. But I think that's really increased. My observation, and it's only my observation, is that the last 4 or 5 years it's much more febrile. It's much more, as you say, toxic. There's much more a sense that there are communities of people who have an axe to grind, who are looking for victims. They're looking for people who have committed thought crime, and their whole mission is to sort of vaporize them, destroy them, and shred every aspect of their lives. I got into trouble a couple of years ago where I've become really fascinated by the debate about IQ and intelligence. So I started reading around that, and I'd written a blog post. I can't remember the details of it now about the whole nature nurture debate and the extent to which genetics was involved, and I made a really careless comment on beneath the line on my blog, where someone had asked me, I can't even remember what the question was, but something about what are the different ways in which IQ breaks down, very carelessly, and without any, I'd just mentioned one of the ways is race, and then with no explanation or no nothing else, and immediately that was picked up, and I was being portrayed as a racist, as a scientific racist, as and to say that was taken out of context, is a complete understatement, because what I hadn't, naively, what I hadn't tried to, nuance, insert into just a comment on the blog, but the nuance of the position, and I followed this up with a second piece explaining, that what I was really saying is that the disparity between IQ scores in America, because this is where we have the data, where that different racial groups, people identify as belonging to different racial groups, have different IQ scores. I was saying that was because of unfair structural environments, and if you identify as being African American, then there's a really high likelihood that you have grown up in an environment where you have less access to the sorts of things which are going to result in you doing well on an IQ test, but that was ignored, and I had several months of just people coming out of nowhere and out of left field and saying you're a racist, you're a Nazi, and weren't interested in the nuance of the debate, and I think that for a lot of people I think they felt that I deserved this for actually raising the topic. They weren't really interested in what opinion I might have on it. I think the position is that people in the far right use these kinds of statistics to support their vile views, and therefore anybody who also looks at the same material is by association, must share their views, even if they're arguing the opposite, because that's too sort of confusing to sort of take on in a soundbite, in a tweet, and all the rest of it. And so that I found that really that really affected me. I sort of basically switched off on social media for about a year or so. I felt just I didn't want to go there, and I've seen that sort of thing happening to various other people. And there's been a few things in the last sort of few months where people have been similarly abused without anyone really being interested in what they actually believe. I mean, I genuinely and sincerely, it wasn't like that 8-9 years ago.
Well, yeah. Well, I guess it really hammers home the incendiary nature of online discourse. Then now, I suppose I jumped the gun a little in saying it was such a positive arena because as you pointed out, it can. Well, yes, I suppose, and I guess the hope is that perhaps maybe it's a naive hope, but the hope would be that maybe a debate where things can be less flammable on all different sides can be something we can move towards in the future. I know it might be aiming for the North Star, so to speak, but who knows?
I mean, I put a book out in 2015 called "What If Everything You Knew About Education Is Wrong," where I tried to I spent quite a bit of that book trying to explore the facts. Basically, I think it is a fact that everybody who is interested in education is essentially well-intentioned. That nobody's setting out to destroy the lives of children. But there are diametrically opposed beliefs and opinions about what's the right thing to do, and if they're diametrically opposed, they can't both be right. And so you get this sort of explosive situation where people feel in the right because what they're arguing is for the best in their belief, everyone's best interest, but they come across people who are saying, no, you're wrong, we should do the opposite. And the instinctive response, I think, is to go, well, you're the baddies. You're either stupid or ignorant, in which and so people go through these phases where they go, the first, oh, you must be ignorant, so I'll educate you. Here's all this stuff, and then when you say, yeah, I've looked at all of that, and they go, well, you must be then stupid because you don't understand it, and you show that you do understand it, but you don't agree with it, and then they say, well, you must be evil. Basically, if you don't, and then if you're evil, it becomes acceptable to treat you in a way which you would never normally want to treat another human being, that actually finding out why people act the way they do when they're under when they have particular beliefs, and why we all find it very difficult to moderate our opinions and take on evidence from opposing camps and change our minds is I think it's an important thing for people to investigate and to look into, so that was something that I wanted to sort of look at through the particular lens of education. So looking at education debates and why do people believe this, why don't they believe that, what happens when they disagree.
It's a really interesting area, and I mean, I suppose we could. I feel like you could talk about that all day with this idea of debate and the nature of it. Unfortunately, I'm going to move us away from that for the time being. Who knows if it'll probably the advantage gap? I do. Who knows if we'll pop back into it later on? But no worries. We'll move away for the time being towards this idea of the advantage gap, because obviously this is something that you have written about quite extensively, both kind of within the context of your blog and within fully published works. It's by no means new within the classroom. It's kind of one that this idea of the advantage gap that has definitely been something that's been around for almost as long, I would say it would be fair to say, as schools have been around. But I was wondering if you could talk to a little bit how the advantage gap and how it manifests itself has developed over time. Does it look differently in a modern classroom as to what it did maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or going even further back?
Okay, so obviously, I think it's going a bit off topic, but so I think it's useful to look at schools as a piece of educational technology that was invented in order to educate as efficiently and effectively as possible. And we've had schools for around about between 4,000 and 5,000 years. And interestingly, we've had schools for the same time and in the same places as we've had writing. So the very first archaeological evidence of writing comes from ancient Sumeria, and all the ancient cuneiform tablets, but also from ancient Sumeria we have the first examples of schools, so-called scribe schools or idubas, where children would be taught in ways which probably we'd find very familiar today, how to read and write cuneiform. And the reason we have this evidence is because we've got the stone tablets that children would write on. We've got thousands and thousands of examples of these found in these what are assumed to be schoolhouses, and some of these describe the day-to-day activities that children would be involved in, and they're remarkably similar to the sorts of things that take place in classrooms around the world to this day. And I think that one strand, one sort of response to hearing that is to go, it's disgraceful that we've been doing the same thing for all of these thousands of years, and nothing's really changed. We immediately should stop what we're doing and invent something new. But my take on that would be the reason we keep doing this is because it's really, really effective. It's a really good way of going about educating large groups of people. And so, every now and again, somebody comes along, with some berserk notion about how to disrupt education. They try these really expensive experiments that fail spectacularly time and time and time again. And we revert to doing what seems to be the most effective way to educate people. So one of the things I'd say, if you want to increase the advantage gap, do try something different. Do something different to schools. That will really mean that the most advantaged children run away with things and the least advantaged are left in the dirt. That schools are a great leveler. And obviously the way in which schools are structured can make things more or less fair. So here in the UK, we've got a fairly large private school system, and that obviously acts to exacerbate the advantage gap. Other countries, private education is a much smaller share, and so that would be more equitable. But one of the things that sort of tends to happen, sort of unconsciously, in schools is that we have unconscious biases. There are psychological ideas that have been sort of researched and written about. One of them that's maybe of interest is an idea called the halo effect, and the halo effect is some irrelevant quality casts a halo, like a saint's halo, that causes us to misperceive other qualities. So, for instance, the way this might work in education is that unconsciously teachers tend to perceive children who are well-spoken and smartly dressed as also being more academically able. And the corollary, if you're not well-spoken and not smartly dressed, you're less likely to be intelligent. And then that those sorts of things can become self-fulfilling prophecies, and that nobody's doing that deliberately, but being aware of these sorts of things can help. I find often, and depending on how you couch it, can make a difference. But pointing this out can make people feel defensive, get their hackles up, and go, "Well, I'm not like that." But it's not a question of morality or ethics. It's just this is a weakness of our cognition. This is a human problem.
Yeah, and it's an unconscious bias shortcut as well. Yeah, just to say, absolutely. So the whole idea, it's somewhat ironic that someone's response would be to say in that scenario, "Oh, I'm not like that," when in fact, if it's an unconscious element, how would you know that you were, unless you were actively asking the question of yourself?
Yeah, I think sort of acknowledging that we all have this tendency to view other human beings tribally, and those that we feel fit a narrow set of criteria about what we find acceptable are also more likely to be good. It's an unpleasant tendency, but nevertheless it's true. It exists, and the pretending it doesn't exist doesn't help anybody. Acknowledging it is the first step to doing something about it, I think.
Yeah, no.
So, sorry.
No, fire away.
No. Honestly, you.
Okay, if you insist. I think possibly we were going to end up in the same place anyway, because what I was going to ask you next was, we've talked there about what the advantage gap is, how it manifests itself, what it looks like, but of course
Yeah,
the natural follow-on to that is closing it, what we can do
yeah,
to tackle the issue, to kind of make the situation more equitable and try and make that advantage gap less of a feature. And I wanted to start this part of the conversation, if you like, from sort of a macro point of view. We'll get
yeah,
into the more individual teacher element in a little
yeah.
bit, but just for a starting point, in terms of closing the advantage gap, what is it that you think that larger institutions, so right at the top level, we're talking about policymakers, in a sort of a governmental, departmental element, and then even schools as separate
Mm,
institutions, and the
yeah.
decision makers atop that particular food chain? What are the things that people in those
Okay.
positions of power can do to close the advantage gap?
Okay. Well, yeah. So what I was sort of hinting at before, yeah, which I probably didn't make the point quite clearly enough, is that if you're making policy decisions about the best way to organise education, schools are a really good bet. So where you don't, where there aren't public schools, you're likely to find a much greater gap than where you do. But how we organise these schools matters, and particularly what we teach, the curriculum and how we go about teaching it, seem to be, seem to make a difference to the likelihood of people from different sections of society doing well. So one of the suggestions that I would encourage people to think about is to offer a curriculum that is that addresses two different aspects of power. So one is the knowledge that confers power. So knowledge which enables you to think things which you wouldn't have otherwise been able to think, which enables you to explain things which you'd otherwise be confused about, which allows you to make generalizations about people and places that you'll never perhaps visit yourself, and just takes you out of the narrow confines of your experience and opens up the wider world for you. So that would be one thing. And so that's something that sometimes gets called powerful knowledge. And the other side of the coin is can be characterized as, and it's distinct, is knowledge of the powerful. This idea of perhaps sometimes thought of as cultural capital, things which are shared and valued across cultures. And the argument would be that if we construct a curriculum model which looks at teaching the knowledge which confers the most power and knowledge which is the most widely shared, then we'll give children the greatest possible access and opportunity to do well in society, to be the human beings that we'd like them to be. And so that would be, contra that, one of the responses to that as a suggestion is that it seems to run up smack against people's priorities for social justice, for deprivileging the currently privileged, for decolonising the curriculum, and these sorts of things. And I think those are worthy aims. But what I'd say is that if we don't teach shared knowledge, if we don't teach the things which are valued and shared across culture, then we're just alienating children from those debates. We're making them ignorant of things that other people value, and that nobody benefits, nobody's emancipated through being ignorant. And that if you're genuine in your desire to create a more just world, then I think that what's important is that you teach this stuff and then give children the tools to critique it. But you can only really be critical of things that you know enough about. So it starts with knowing these things and then asking the awkward questions. So that would be one side of it. And then once you've made some decisions about the an equitable curriculum offer that will be disproportionately advantageous to the least advantaged members of society, the next thing to think about is how you go about children learning that. And there's no doubt when you look at the different sort of arguments and debates about how children should learn, that one of the really popular ideas is that children should be encouraged to discover things for themselves. They should work together, follow their interests, and look at what's sort of relevant to them. And that sort of approach is absolutely going to widen the advantage gap. It's fine to do with children who are already advantaged, children who have a strong knowledge base, who come from advantaged socioeconomic profiles and can be supported for whatever deficits that exist in the school, can be supported through home. But it's an appalling way to treat people that don't have those advantages from their own background. So if you're genuinely interested in narrowing the gap, then the most ethical and equitable thing to do is to teach in a way which maximizes all children getting the same access to what we've decided is important through the way we teach. So that would include whole class interactive discussion, where you've got you're privileging your knowledgeable teacher who's transmitting what you've decided is important for everybody to know, and everybody's getting the same access to that, which is then being debated and questioned within that teacher-mediated environment. And that would be my that sort of model. Is what I'm suggesting is more equitable, because it's more in line with what the cognitive science suggests to us about how people learn most efficiently and effectively.
Hey folks, hope you're enjoying the episode so far, and we've got plenty more to come after this quick break. Here at Atomy Brainwaves, we're all about education, and not just for students, for ourselves too. We would love to hear from you, whether that's feedback on one of our episodes or a question you'd like to see answered by one of our guests or by Sue. So, if you've got a comment or a question, don't hesitate to email us at brainwaves@getatomy.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, let's get back to it. Just to kind of examine that point, it's a really interesting position to take, but is there... So you talked a little bit about how, the shortcomings of the idea of students being, whatever their particular thing is and kind of going down that versus the benefits of the collective class all together and that kind of interactive discussion. Is there a world in which those two things can coexist or even... I'm trying to find the best way to phrase this, but a sort of a way in which you can have both of those elements, where it is interactive, where it's group-based, but there is also the scope for individual students. I know, as you say, that absolutely does favor the more advantaged students within the situation, but is there a world where those two things can exist within a school structure, or do you think it would have to be a situation where that side of things, the more individualized elements, that has to be taken outside of the school situation altogether in pursuit of closing the advantage gap?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the first sort of thing to sort of question is why are we wedded to something that actually might be iniquitous? What is it that's attractive about an idea, a view of education, which actually seems to make lives harder for the people we want to help most? So that would be that's something to think about, because I really recognise there is something really attractive about freedom and individuality and naturalness, and we have all of these ideas that sort of trickle down unexamined, and actually that I don't think we think very critically about them. That a lot of this stuff stems from the ideas about education put forward by Rousseau in his novel Emile, sort of about following children's natural interests, and it sounds lovely. And anything that talks about natural and growth and all of this stuff sort of appeals to this romantic sense of what it is to be an individual and that childhood being magical and special. And that one of the things that's quite interesting is that's really only a concern in certain parts of the world, and that if you visit parts of the world where they perhaps don't have the luxury to think about those ideas, it's not something that comes up. So, I've spent a bit of time in looking at classrooms in sub-Saharan Africa, And typically there, what you'll get is classrooms where you've got 60, 70, 80, maybe over 100 children in a room, and you'll have a teacher and a chalkboard, and you'll have them giving instruction. You'll have children sort of doing choral responses to the teacher's instruction. And I think the instinct of a lot of people from who feel they know better from the West, they go in and they go, oh, there's not enough individuality. It's far too didactic. You want to get them working in groups. And so this happens, and sort of teachers in these circumstances are made to feel guilty about what they do. These teachers, these experts come along and try and train people up in how to do these things, and they don't work. They're just not effective, especially in that sort of scale. I think anyone who suggests that sort of thing could be effective has to show with themselves in a classroom of 100 children, teaching them how to read. They have to show how that could be, how they could do it. And I don't think, I've never seen anyone come even vaguely close to being able to do that kind of thing. But what is possible, and it's maybe not the perfect way to get children to learn, but what is possible in a room full of 60, 70, 80, 100 plus children is to have effective whole class interactive discussions and debate mediated through a teacher. And that becomes doable. That's something you can model to teachers in those situations and go, here's how these things work, and here's how you can add nuance to sort of what you're currently doing. But so here we are back, with our sort of Silicon Valley dreams of, everybody sort of, sitting on beanbags and having an iPad and sort of following their own bespoke curriculum. And if you know enough, if you're from a privileged enough background, there is this massive safety net to ensure that, following your own limited, narrow scope of interest probably won't do you any long-term harm. But if you're a child from a disadvantaged background and told, do what you're most interested in, here's an iPad, look stuff up, even with the best will in the world, even where children are really conscientious and committed, they don't know enough to be able to make good choices. So they're always going to be making suboptimal choices, and they're always going to be limited in the vantage that they have. So to go to your question, the meat of your question, where you say, is there any room at all for children working in groups? And yeah, of course there is, but where it's naturally useful. So, for instance, if you're teaching a sports lesson, the idea of children not working in groups to play football would be ridiculous. They have to work in groups because that's how team sports work. Or if you're wanting somebody to do a drama lesson where you're putting you're getting people to sort of work out a piece of theatre, you can't do that by yourself. Well, arguably you can, but the purpose of it is that you do that in a group. When you go along to mathematics teachers and say, right, these children are learning about quadratic equations, and it'd be much better that they do it in a group. Why? That's just odd. Get children working in groups where it's useful for them to do so, but don't insist on it where it isn't. And the children following their own interests, that happens de facto anyway. That children are only in school for the minority of their childhoods. The rest of the time, they're free to follow their own interests, and it's that as much as anything else, which is responsible for a lot of the gaps that we have in educational outcomes. That children from certain backgrounds have far more access to pursue certain ideas which are likely to be much more valued in an academic context than others, and so. I'm not at all suggesting that children shouldn't be following their own interests, but if school exacerbates that, then it's taking a more or less level playing field and tilting it and making it impossible for certain children to do well in.
Yeah, it's a really interesting critique of that kind of mentality, and I suppose for all of this idea, as you talk about, of focusing on the individual and the natural growth element, it's definitely a really interesting point to make about how that can I suppose, focus too heavily on this idea of the individual and maybe ignore the more uncomfortable truths related to that. Let me just pause it for a moment. A counterpoint, if I may.
Yes.
Play devil's advocate of a sort.
No, please.
To use your example of the quadratic equation classroom, where you say that the benefits of the individual, or the benefits of teaching it to the whole class collectively outweigh this idea of breaking into smaller groups, for instance. If, let's say that, imagine a scenario where you have your class of, 30, and there might be, I get, this may be less of a question about advantage gap specifically, but where you have a situation where you have your class of 30, you're teaching them quadratic equations, and there may be, let's say, 10 students in the class who, for whatever reason, they get it straight away. They only need to hear it explained once. You have 10 who, they sort of get it, but they're struggling with a little bit of elements. And then you have another 10 students who are just really not following what the teacher is doing. And the teacher is transmitting the same lesson to all of these 3 different groups. So in that scenario, what would you say that might be an example where actually there might be a benefit to this idea of breaking into groups where it can be taught in different ways to the 3, or might that even have the side effect of furthering a gap between these 3 groups in the classroom? I know it's a tricky kind of, and it's very...
It is a tricky...
It's a hypothetical, but just where do you land on that?
To paraphrase, a quotation, what makes teaching possible is that children are so similar, and what makes it hard is that they're different. And now, obviously, if you could deliver the same information to all children, they all understood it perfectly, then teaching would just not be a challenging job at all, and that isn't reality. So you're absolutely, let's take your classroom of thirds. So I'm a teacher, and I've decided that I'm teaching to continue with the idea of quadratic equations. I've taught that operation, and 10 children immediately understand it and are able, and I probably can anticipate maybe who they're likely to be, because I've been teaching the class for a while. So there's that instruction having taken place, they have some guided practice to get on with. I know that there's another group of children that haven't perhaps are not at the same place yet. So with those children off and running, I can then focus on smaller and smaller and smaller groups until I've got the balance of the class working on guided practice, and maybe just a few who are still receiving the instruction. And I think that, to me, is a strong argument for a teacher-led environment, because I think that if you differentiate your instruction, if you say these children are more able than these children, so therefore I will teach them different content, and I'll teach them at a different pace, then we ensure that whatever their starting position is, they accelerate faster and further. Yeah. But if I take other children and say, I'm going to teach you less challenging material at a slower pace, we ensure that they fall further and further behind each time that happens. And so it would be fair and true to say that you're never going, and it's probably undesirable to have complete symmetry between everybody sort of learning at the same rate, but it's not exacerbating it, and it's not, and it's trying to reduce that I think is the important point. So some children do just have all sorts of advantages, and it's not that they should be held back, but when if instead, let's say an approach to teaching that classroom would be to say, you've identified those groups of thirds, the children that really get it, the ones who are not sure and the ones who definitely don't. Let's put everyone into groups of 3, so they have one of each, where the child that really gets it explains what's going on to the others. Well, firstly, it would be a leap of faith to think that the child that gets it to the same degree as their teacher. With potentially years of experience with explaining and sort of predicting misconceptions and all the rest of it. So the likelihood there is that you've got a child that maybe does get it, but not well enough to explain it, and actually ends up passing on something which ends up confusing their peers. There was a really interesting and seminal piece of research done in New Zealand some time ago by a guy called Graham Nuttall, who found that when we watch what children are doing in classrooms, they do things which that we don't always expect them to do. So things like, one of the things that his experiment, his observations, he rigged up classes with microphones and cameras and sort of watched what children were doing. And one of the things he found was that that when a teacher starts teaching something, actually children will know roughly between 40 and 50% of what the teacher's teaching, but they'll all know like a different set of it. So we have this prior knowledge, which is important, but we're all have different pieces of the puzzle. We're all making meaning in our own limited ways, and some of us are, more fortunate than others with the speed at which we make progress. But when you put children together and get them to pass on their understandings, more often than not, at least 50% of the time, Nuttall reckoned, children would be passing on information which was incorrect.
Okay. Interesting.
So that's a real weakness of that kind of, putting children in groups for some kind of performance, perfect. Putting children into groups for instruction, idiocy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very compelling counterpoint, I suppose, to the situation. I mean, what kind of shines through for me is, I guess it's not, no situation is ever going to be completely black or white. Do you know what I mean? There's always going to be a case to be made, but it certainly is,
that's really fair.
Yeah, a strong
I think there were
point
two. No, there were two things to say about that. That there'll always be some children for whom this isn't true, some teachers for whom it isn't true, some classrooms, some school, but they are in a minority. And if we're in a position of being able to give guidance and to make suggestions, suggesting what's unlikely to work for the majority is just foolish. And the other thing to say is that a lot of ideas about how schools and classrooms can operate are actually really, really complex and nuanced, and require an awful lot of training and thought and care in the way they're implemented, and so are particularly prone to lethal mutation. They're likely to end up being done badly because they're overcomplicated. So one of the sort of the one of the razors that you could apply to educational decision making is how complex is it to implement this intervention, this policy. And if it doesn't meet a low bar, don't do it, because even if it has potentially rich benefits, you almost certainly won't get them.
Yeah,
you're much better off doing something which offers fewer benefits, but is far more likely to be faithfully implemented.
Yeah, and it definitely stands to reason within the classroom, the school as an institution. It is an institution of the collective, and so it totally stands to reason to have the position of the benefit, the overarching benefits of the collective comes first, I suppose. It's an absolutely fair position to start from. I'm going to move though. Well, actually, sorry, okay. It still remains within the collective, but from this kind of, we've almost touched on a little bit there. But what I wanted to do, because obviously this is, teachers are going to be listening to this, I wanted to move this idea and what we've talked about into the classroom. We've already done it with the example that we discussed there, but this idea of closing the advantage gap, which we've talked about there, kind of the bigger ideals of it, within the confines of a particular classroom, where you're the teacher, you have the students who are in front of you within, the confines of the autonomy and the power that you hold within that environment. What can you do as the teacher there to try and limit the effect of this advantage gap, to try and close it as best you can?
So the first step then is essentially the same as what I've already suggested at a policy level, is that you think carefully about the content that you're wanting the children in your care to learn. And one of the things which occasionally still surprises me when I visit schools is I sometimes say to teachers, "Why are you teaching this?" And they go, "Don't know. I'm not sure. I just am." We've done it. We did it the last year, and the kids seem to like it. Or we've been told to do it. Someone said it, or I found it on a internet resource and it seemed like a good idea. And I think that the first step is to really, really, really care about what you're teaching, That if you can't absolutely, when questioned, have a watertight rationale for its importance, then there's a possibility at least that you might not be teaching the right things. And so when you're not teaching the right things, your more advantaged children are less disadvantaged by that. Your more disadvantaged children are catastrophically disadvantaged by that sort of thing. So that would be the first thing. Think carefully about what it is that you're teaching them. And that's going to, exactly what that will look like will depend on the age, the subject, all phase of education, all of these different things. My background is an English teacher. So one of the things which was definitely the case when I started as a teacher was there was a fairly sort of uncritically examined idea that what we were doing as English teachers, we were teaching reading and writing skills. That we thought of English as being a skills-based subject, and there were various skills that were reading skills, various skills that are writing skills. And so if we wanted children to be successful, we would teach those skills. And because we were teaching skills, it didn't really matter. The vehicle for that didn't really matter. The content wasn't important. It was just a mechanism for learning the skill. And so, what would often happen is that, as a classroom teacher, you'd think to yourself, what would be the most accessible, relevant piece of fiction for a child to experience in order that I can teach them these skills? So we'd give them texts which didn't really open up much of the world to them. It didn't tell them much about how people might have lived and thought in different times and places, and just sort of confronted them with the familiarities of their own experiences, things that they already knew, and went, oh yeah, life is like that. Yeah. And that might well be comforting, but it's certainly not enlarging. And I think that, as a one threshold for education should be that it ought to enlarge, not just comfort. Well, maybe not comfort at all. Maybe it should be discomforting. Anyway, and if instead, so if that's true, if you are just teaching skills, maybe that's fair enough. But it's not even true that a lot of the things that we thought of as being these skills that we were teaching are actually functions of what functions of textual knowledge and extra textual knowledge. And that, for instance, if you want to teach children to make an inference about a text, you can tell them what an inference is. It's reading between the lines. So you're trying to look at the things which are not explicitly stated. What do you think the writer's trying to convey? And you give children, a relatively simple story to look at and say, what's the writer getting at here? And they go, oh, maybe he's suggesting this. And you go, great, you've made an inference. Let's practice doing that kind of thing. But the minute they try and read something and then make an inference about something that they don't know anything about, they realise they have no skill of making inferences. That the skill of making inferences is actually something that you can only do when you know enough to be able to have something that you can spot and something valid to say. So, and that's, that would be true for the, I think that would be equally true for the way that we teach writing and other aspects of reading as well. So if you want children if you're interested in children making inferences, you need to give them tech. You need to teach them about the world. They need to know a lot. They need a huge breadth of knowledge about not just text, but things outside the text. The more of that they know, the more likely they are to be able to make a valid inference when it's incumbent upon them to do so. Yeah. And so texts which open up the world, which give children knowledge that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, are far more likely to narrow this gap. That one of the things that I'd sort of find as a younger teacher is I do those kinds of lessons that I've just been describing, and some kids get it. Some kids are away with it and they've got it, but they're the ones who are probably from those advantaged backgrounds.
Yeah.
Disproportionately, the children that don't get it are the ones who've let a smaller base of background knowledge. And I came to think of this idea as that some children, your more advantaged children, are more likely to possess intellectual Velcro. That what they possess means that the stuff that they encounter in school sticks to them, and that more disadvantaged children sometimes seem to have something that's more like intellectual Teflon, where what's being taught to them just has nothing to adhere to. And so it's much, much harder for them to acquire this stuff. So they just need more and more of it.
Yeah. And it's, the example you give, no, I was going to say it kind of does. It ties back very well to the original point of how well thought out that it has to be. I think it's a really, it almost sounds simple to say that a teacher needs to know exactly why they're doing whatever they do. But as the examples you gave about teachers you ask not really having any idea, I know obviously that's not true at all of the majority, but it is something that has to be.
I think it's true of us all at times. I've certainly been guilty of that. I think everybody's has the tendency to have not thought enough about what they're doing. So we're no one's immune from it.
Or even to the fullest degree. You know, it's not a yes or no thing. It's a spectrum, isn't it? And you can have, I suppose that the point being that, as you say, you need to have a watertight, ironclad explanation for why you're doing something. Even if you're nearly there of sort of like, oh yeah, I can see the benefits of doing this and blah, 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 blah. I suppose the point is, no, that's not enough. It needs to be fully thought out.
It's never going to be perfect. I think the process of designing a great curriculum is always iterative. You're always going to be refining and adding and, learning from your mistakes. So I certainly wouldn't want people to feel anxious or guilty about what they've got.
Of course.
I wouldn't say necessarily to teachers, your explanation's got to be ironclad. It's just got to be a reasonable rationale. You've got to have, you've got to be able to justify what you're doing.
Yeah.
If someone asks you. And I think, other sorts of questions which reveal that kind of, that thought process is to say, why are you teaching this in term 1 and not term 2? And if they go, I don't know, really, just thought that'd be nice there, then that's a real potential weakness. I think that if you can say, well, the reason we're doing it here is because it's sequenced in these particular ways, and so we're building on what's been covered here, and we're going to go to this new stuff which is opened up at this point, then you've got a strong argument for your curriculum being organised the way you've chosen to organise it. But it's just worth asking those kinds of questions, not to make people feel bad about it, but just to give them an opportunity to go, oh, okay, maybe we can do better thinking.
Yeah, of course, and improve further along that spectrum and make it even more. That idea of sequencing absolutely ties into that. Make sure that everything there's, as you say, a reasonable explanation for all of the decisions being made. I wanted to just quickly ask you, within this context of what teachers can do, and I suppose even within what bigger institutions with schools can do, where do you fall, or what will your thoughts be in relation to the role that technology and online resources can play in closing the advantage gap? Because obviously that's something very relevant to us at Atomi as a company, and it's also very relevant right now within the world of education, because in this lockdown, so many schools are being forced, or have been forced, to bring almost the entirety of the learning experience for this moment, at least, into the online world. So we've talked quite extensively on this podcast about various different ways that online resources can play into different methodologies, but just specifically within our central subject, closing the advantage gap, do you think there is a part that technology, that online resources can play in pursuit of that goal?
Yeah, I do. So just at the moment, here in the UK, there's a big debate at the moment about schools reopening, and there's various sort of sections of the media sort of branding teachers as being layabouts and cowards for not going back to school and all this. And one of the pieces, one of the bits of narrative bits of rhetoric that has found its way into the narrative is that there's very much a sense that it's unfair to the poorest people in society because they're not getting access to the normal curriculum offer, and those are the ones that will suffer most. And it's really fascinating that at the moment this seems to be coming from the right of the political spectrum. People who, typically we don't think of as being concerned with the lives of the less well off. But it seems to suit this particular narrative. So it's something that's being played out. But I think there's, most people would agree that the probability is that lockdown and the coronavirus and all the rest of it will probably have a disproportionate effect on the poorest people in society, the most disadvantaged. That's probably true. And I think, the fact that we've had this pandemic now in 2020, when, huge swathes of the population have access to the internet and to online offers in a way which wouldn't have been possible even a few years ago. That's been amazing. I've certainly over the last 8-9 weeks I've learned a lot about having doing lots this sort of thing, various sorts of online things which I wouldn't have done in the past. And I'm very grateful and thankful that it exists. But I do think, a poor substitute for a teacher in a classroom with students, and that being a sort of mechanism that pretty much everybody, no matter their political affiliations, wants to get back to. But so I think that when you're looking at, in normal times at the role of educational technology, it's useful and important to ask what problem it's solving.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the tech solutions that are out there, they're solutions to problems that people don't have.
Okay.
So, and I think there are, and I'm not sort of suggesting that anybody's nefarious in any particular way, but you take something like, like let's say something like the Google Classroom or Microsoft Teams or any of these sorts of things, and they're great products, and they're designed, to do interesting things in particular ways. But I think that a lot of the time that happens is, we've designed this sort of platform which would be great for the corporate world. Let's see if we can, get it into classrooms as well. And that's a sort of secondary issue. And it's not, it's just, how can we spread our brand as far and as wide as we can? And, that's the world we live in, and I'm not particularly critical of that. I just don't think, that some of the evangelism that goes with that, this is in some way an optimum educational experience for children, I don't think is defensible, particularly. But when we look at we look at a problem like, teachers feel overburdened with administration or marking. That's a genuine problem. How can we solve that in a way which reduces workload without compromising children's experience of education? Those are really, really useful things to do. Or recognising actually human beings are really poor when you've got subjective measures of like what's good and bad. Teachers are really poor about making judgments on those sorts of things when you're looking at across more than one measure and across lots of different pieces of students' work. So trying to find an online solution to that, or sorry, not an online, a technological solution to that would solve a very genuine problem that definitely exists. Or even how, that we know, for instance, here's what we're doing in the classroom, and we know children are going to go off, especially as they get older and they're preparing for national exams. They're going to buy revision resources. They're going to spend money on stuff. How can we ensure, as an ed tech provider, that we're using the very, very best research on how children make good memories and how they build on those and how they get to the point where they're most likely to be able to access that information at the point that they need it most. Those sorts, then again, you're solving a genuine question in a bespoke way, and those sorts of things I think are important. So, without sort of, I don't know if you want me to get into particular products, but
no need.
But I think, that's. I think that we're, I think that we're, we said it earlier, we're tribal in our approaches to different things, and I think that when we identify as being, a fan of technology, it becomes very hard for us to be broad-minded enough to go, this technology is really, really great, and that's rubbish.
Yeah, properly critical.
And it's really hard not to make. Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's that it's people tend to have these all or nothing views, and I think that some of the ways that some of the really large companies have infiltrated education have led to some unhelpful ways where you're getting individual teachers to brand themselves as being Google teachers or Apple teachers and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's something quite sort of distasteful about that, and I'm sure lots of people get in touch to say how angry they are about somebody having criticised the thing they like. And it's not that I think that the products of any of those companies are bad. It's just that giving yourself a badge, giving yourself a tribal affiliation makes you less clear-sighted. And if you are in that sort of situation and you're still able to think critically about what you're asked to do and to go, actually, I disagree. This product's being marketed by, actually that would be unhelpful. Fine, great, but just the tendency is in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there in the sense of, and I feel like it's fair to say this is a kind of a theme that has run through closing the advantage gap in all contexts we've looked at, this idea of having rational, reasonable explanations for why you're using whatever resource, taking whatever technique, the idea of the student being at the center of it and thinking about the collective being at the center of it and being able to be properly critical along the way. And I think it's something that definitely, holds water. It's definitely, it's good to hear you say, because I think that here at Atomy, that's an approach that we try to take. But whether it's with an online resource or whether if it's a policymaker at the top level or a teacher within their classroom, it's definitely a kind of an ideology that is an important one to hold. I feel like we could talk about this forever and ever, but we are mindful. We don't want to keep our listeners forever. So we'll ask. I wanted to ask you quickly to wrap up our conversation a little bit about cognitive psychology and how this plays. Okay. I know. I feel like I've said I wanted to ask you quickly, and then it's a very meaty issue. So take your time. But I do know that within your own writing, it's something that plays a really big part in how cognitive psychology and the findings and the research into cognitive psychology within education ties into your writing in general, but also within this idea of closing the advantage gap. So I just wanted to ask you quickly about that and the role that plays within your research and how it has influenced your thoughts or the relation to our broader theme of the advantage gap.
Okay. Well,
a big question to say. Quickly, but
while I'm here, I'll take this sort of shameless opportunity to plug another book.
Of course.
A book I co-wrote with a guy called Nick Rose called What Every Teacher Needs to Know About Psychology. And in that, we very much tried to sort of answer that question. And of course, in a very partial and biased way, obviously. But what we decided was important for people to know about was how memory works. This seems to be something, certainly here in the UK, that more and more teachers are seeing as an absolute sort of right and duty that they know more about how memories are formed and accessed. So we talk particularly about that, but also the role of which we've kind of hinted on briefly, the role of prior knowledge, how knowing things. The more you know, the easier it is to learn. The more you know about something specific, the easier it is to learn that stuff. So that's really important. I think one of the, perhaps, if I just take one area so that it's not too wide a discussion, one of the most interesting and apt areas for teachers to sort of think and look about is the difference between how novices and experts think and learn and respond to different scenarios. And there's definitely, there's a lot of literature out there about this. But broadly speaking, the less you know about something, so we're all novices at whatever it is that we don't know anything about. Whenever we're a novice, we by dint of the fact that we don't have much relevant prior knowledge, we are trying to handle an awful lot of new information at once, which makes the thinking that we do very effortful and laborious, makes us prone to mistakes, makes us prone to being forgetful and getting confused, and means that as novices trying to handle a lot of new information, we're likely to come up with something which is suboptimal. So just to sort of make that concrete, last Christmas, I decided, I don't know why I did this, but I decided I was going to make a souffle, a Grand Marnier souffle. I'd always fancied doing it. So I got my Good Housekeeping cookery book, and there's a recipe in there that I wanted to follow. And I got all my ingredients, and I sort of went laboriously through the steps. And I found it quite, I'm not a completely inexperienced home cook, but I always find it difficult when following a new recipe because you're just not sure what's coming. And I found that one particular instruction in the recipe book quite confounding, where it said I put all of the bits and pieces in a mixing bowl, and it said to beat the consistency until it's just right. I don't know what that is. How will I know? And then I got, I did that, and it comes time to put it in the oven, and it says make sure, oh Christ, I was meant to put the oven on at a particular temperature, and I've forgotten. I had to go back and I had to wait, and I probably put it in before it was the right temperature. Anyway, the upshot of it was that my souffle didn't rise. It looked a bit of a shocking mess, and I know,
such a shame.
So what I learned from that experience is never ever try making a souffle ever again. Buy one from the shop, get someone else to, but don't go through that because, probably I'm going to fail. And I think that's an experience that children have day in, day out in the classroom, where they're asked to do things, they're asked to handle information in ways which make it less likely that they're going to be successful. Yeah. And so they have this experience of failure, and then they think to themselves, well, I'm just rubbish at that. The next time, like, go back to our example of the quadratic equations earlier. So you've asked them to do some algebra, they failed at it, and then the next time quadratic equations comes up, they now have a relevant memory, and the relevant memory is I'm shit at this. So that's what's operating on them. Now, if you're an expert, if I've made like a ton of souffles in the past, I'm a really good souffle maker. And somebody comes along and says, hey, why don't you do like a really interesting souffle challenge where you do all sorts of things that have never been tried in the souffle world before? I can think to myself, yeah, why not? I'll take all of what I know about souffle making and all the other stuff I know about desserts, and I'll come up with something really interesting, which has a reasonable chance of success because of my expertise.
Yeah.
And I can do much more interesting and creative thing. If I do fail at it, if it doesn't plan out, I might think to myself, it's because I didn't do this, or, of course I should have seen that coming. And we'll be much more, our reflections on our failure will be much more productive than if we've had no experience of success. So one of the observations is that if you're a novice, the disproportionate likelihood is that your learning is going to be most effective when it is broken down into manageable parts. So carefully sequenced, carefully explained, modelled, with the teacher working through examples. And then when you get to having a go yourself, they're guiding your practice. So, for instance, if I had someone at my shoulder going, the consistency is just right there, leave it alone. That's the kind of role that we can have brilliantly. So sometimes as teachers, we have this expertise that we know what's right, but it's really, really hard to put it into words. So we spot children doing it right and go, that's it. We communicate our tacit knowledge in that way, and it's really, really powerful. But if you're an expert, you do genuinely learn best by being told, just go off and explore whatever there is to explore. Find out what bring your expertise to bear on this problem. And actually, if I tried to stop them and said, here's a worksheet, then that actually gets in the way. They have to sort of ignore the instructions in order to follow their instincts. So that's a real disparity at the heart. That as teachers, the likelihood is we're experts, we're knowledgeable, we know a lot about the subject, we taught it before, and that one of the things that seems to be true for a lot of experts is that we are likely to overestimate what novices know about the subject. There was a lovely experiment that was done some years ago now, where subjects were divided into two groups, and the one group was called tappers, and the other group was called listeners. And the tappers were given a list of about 150 popular songs, and obviously the listeners didn't get that list. And then they were partnered up, and the top tappers would tap out. I don't know if you can hear me tapping, but they'd tap out the rhythm of the song. And the listener had to guess what it is. And the listeners were rubbish at it, and they got something like, I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but they got something like less than 2%, I think, something like that, really, really low. But the tappers estimated that their listener would get around about 50% right.
There you go.
And I know, because when you're tapping out the rhythm, you can also hear the melody in your head, and it's really difficult to imagine that other people can't hear what you can hear. So
I think I've been in that exact position myself. I've met just vague memories of tapping, playing that game, tapping, and being frustrated. Like, how can you not tell? It's "We Will Rock You," of course, but
of course,
it's a totally different experience on the other side.
Well, I think sometimes as teachers we have that experience where we're tapping out our subjects, and it's obvious. And when kids don't get it, it's like, come on, it's "We Will Rock You," and they're like, what is it? And they're trying to guess sometimes. And so if we can shift ourselves back into what it's like to be, so a lot of, one of the things that we do as experts is we go, right, I'm going to teach you a skill. But that doesn't really work that effectively unless you're looking at other experts. If you're working with novices, it's much better to go, let's break down the skill. Let's look at all of the different bits that it's composed of. Let's try and learn each of those, and then let's put them together and practice them until you become skilled.
Yeah.
And that's the way around. And so one of the things that I would suggest to sort of bridge this is to say that children, before you do anything else, they've got to experience success. And that often requires a lot of help, a lot of support, but you make them feel that they can be successful, and then they're happy to take on more challenging stuff. They're happy to do things which put them outside of their comfort zone because they've got a firm foundation of success to work with. But if you ask them to do anything challenging or unfamiliar without an experience of success, you'll end up alienating a good part of, and actually teaching students that they can't do it, that they're rubbish at it, that this isn't for them. And again, I would say that that's disproportionately more likely to be the fate of the least advantaged students in the classroom.
Yeah. No, it's a really sound finding and very well condensed from its, I'm sure, very scholastically outlined cognitive psychological explanation into a very, very relatable example of this idea of tapping versus listening. So thank you very much for that. I as much as I don't want to do it, we've got to wrap up our of course, broader conversation.
Lovely to talk to you, Simon.
Before I let you go, though, you're not quite off the hook yet.
Oh, no.
And I know, we're nearly there. We always like to finish with our guests by getting just a very quick little piece of advice or maybe a little anecdote from your teaching days. Doesn't have to be serious. It can be totally fun, whatever. It doesn't even have to be a long one. It can be just a quick line of advice, just something for our teacher listeners out there. So what have you got for us?
This might backfire, but a piece of advice that I was given early in my career as a teacher, which I've treasured, is don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness.
Okay.
And you're much more likely, if you ask for permission, then people might say no, and then where are you? But if you just do what you feel is right and do it to the best of your ability, and it doesn't work, say sorry.
Okay.
But probably you won't have to say sorry all that often. Alrighty,
so good advice. Teachers out there, take that on board. Obviously, within reason, I would add the caveat. We don't want teachers.
We don't want a lawsuit.
Yes, exactly. But within reason, sound advice. That is all that we have time for today. David, thank you so much for joining us. It was a really engaging conversation.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No worries. To all of our listeners, if you want to catch any other episodes, you can listen to us on whatever platform you're listening to this on, or if you want to check out Atomy, you can head to the main site at getatomy.com. For the time being, it is goodbye from David and goodbye from me. See ya.